As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
Welcome back to another episode of The Malcolm Effect with Mamadou. As always, I know I say this a lot, but when I say I'm super excited to have our guest on today, his work has illuminated my thinking and has helped me formulate my own thoughts around several issues thinking about race and capitalism. So please welcome, for the first time and surely not the last time, to The Malcolm Effect, Arun Kundnani. How's it going?
I'm good, man. Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure, honestly. I had the fortunate experience to catch up with Arun at Cornell quite recently, and this is just a continuing of that conversation. So my first question is, considering organizing for Palestine in this moment, what is your assessment of where we are in the USA and also the UK? What do you think some of the things we should be proud about, I guess, in this moment, or what progress do you think we've made in your time seeing organizing for Palestine, and where do you think we can still go harder on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a remarkable moment, right? I don't think we've ever seen this kind of thing in the United States of this number of people getting mobilized around Palestine. And I was in Washington D.C. a few weeks ago. I never thought I'd see the day, to be honest, of like that many Palestinian flags flying down, Pennsylvania Avenue. It was remarkable, and it's clearly that that lots of people who, it's not just the kind of hardcore of those of us who've kind of been around for a while, kind of been involved in trying to think about this stuff for a while in the United States. It was just like a lot of the phrase is ordinary people. They're not ordinary people, but like folks who hadn't been necessarily active on this stuff before, not necessarily people active in anything politically before, just saying like, actually this is just wrong. Like, it's not complicated, it's simple. It's like, I just know that this has to be wrong, and that because my government is not opposed to it and is in fact funding it and supporting it and supplying the weapons, it falls to me as an individual to have that moral responsibility just to take to the streets and show that this is something that we have to stop immediately. And a good number of those people are Jews who are just saying like, this isn't what it means to be a Jew, right? This is like, to me, being a Jew means that you don't do this stuff. And so this is so it's a special moment. We're seeing all kinds of new organizing, and what's happening is that the Zionists in the United States are basically, they understand that they've kind of lost the argument at this point, right? And especially amongst young people, where the opinion polling is saying that the majority of young people in the United States want a ceasefire. They don't support Israel doing what it's doing, and so they've lost the argument, and so they're turning to censorship. They're using wealth and power to try and impose their views now, rather than persuasion. All the old kind of propaganda that they used to have Israel as this kind of plucky startup nation of historical victims of anti-Semitism and all these kind of things. I don't think they're working anymore, and I think they know they're not working. And so they're just saying, well, we have some people who've got money who can basically withdraw their donations to universities if intimidating universities into basically becoming more repressive towards people mobilizing for Palestine, right? And it's interesting to me. Like, I don't think that we've seen, thinking about yesterday what happened in Congress, right, where we had these presidents of University of Pennsylvania, MIT, and Harvard kind of hauled before Congress and accused of allowing anti-Semitism to flourish on their campuses. And the examples of anti-Semitism were people chanting slogans with the word intifada in it. And so then that became, the question was, well, if you allow that, then you're supporting calls for the genocide of Jews, which is obviously preposterous. It's the kind of there's something that happens when you're a colonizer to your sense of reality, right? Like when you're a colonizer, you start to see threats everywhere, right? And the slightest disagreement, the slightest challenge, even in the form of speech, is interpreted as inherently violent, right? And inherently aimed at wiping you out, right?
Yeah.
It's not it's one of the kind of pathologies that is familiar to us if we've studied the history of colonialism, right? We've seen it.
Read our Fanon.
If we've read our Fanon, if we've looked at any of these situations, right, we know what this is, right? And
Absolutely.
and that's what was playing out yesterday in Congress. Now, no one in their right minds looks to the United States for moral leadership on any of these things. But to have, while the United States is supplying weapons for a genocide, for that to be the debate in Congress, right, is I mean, it's an outrage that even by US standards is remarkable. And it's transparent, when you create this situation where the people running the universities, they have been absolutely pathetic in simply prostrating themselves before these demands from Zionist funders, abandoning any pretense of kind of principles of freedom of expression and academic freedom, which just a few months ago they were saying were the most important things for universities. At Cornell, the president this was meant to be the year when Cornell celebrated freedom of expression, right? And that was announced. That was announced in the wake of the apologizing when Ann Coulter was heckled and decided to end her talk last year. Ann Coulter, who is an anti-Semite, it's not. So you can allow an anti-Semite, in fact, to speak at Cornell in the name of freedom of expression, but you can't say Intifada. And you can't say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, which are not anti-Semitic slogans, but slogans that demand freedom for the Palestinian people.
Thank you so much for that. I know you wrote a brilliant piece in which I actually quoted that line in an interview where you said, the question should be, where do you think from the river to the sea that Palestinians shouldn't be free? But as we find that we're in this discursive battle at the moment of what can we say, what can't we say, should we allow some slogans, should we not say certain things? When people are saying these slogans are interpreted as genocide of the Jews, it does less, it becomes a distraction. I'm of the opinion that racism is always going to be a distraction. They're always going to find things to distract us with from talking about the actual issues. But I think these rallying calls are what they say. And Intifada symbolizes a resistance against colonialism, colonial domination. From the river to the sea is calling for Palestinian liberation and has nothing to do with genocide of the Jews. So speaking to, I guess, some organizers, what would you say about these slogans?
I mean, I think it's essential that we don't allow ourselves to be moved away from the terrain on which we want to articulate our struggle and kind of concede ground. I mean, there's a kind of basic moral imperative of kind of respect for your fellow human beings, of respect for other people that you share a space with, to listen to what they're saying and so on. That to me doesn't extend to a kind of self-censorship that panders to what is essentially a kind of a psychological fragility that is a symptom of being a colonizer, right? I don't think you pander to that. I think because it doesn't actually help them in the end either to pander to it, right? I think if you recognize that that's what we're dealing with, then our job in relation to people who believe that these slogans are anti-Semitic is to show them how, in the end, these are slogans for freedom, and in the end, their freedom is going to be bound up with the freedom of the Palestinians, right? And this is so. It's not that we ignore these arguments and simply avoid engaging them, but we have to engage them on our terms, right? And with a vision of how, in the end, we have to liberate ourselves from colonialism, and also, therefore, the colonizer gets liberated as well, right? I mean, I think that's
Absolutely.
the principle here, right? And obviously sometimes that assumes a certain good faith on their part as well, right? But a lot of the time there is not good faith, and they know exactly what they're doing in going after. I mean, I think we have to distinguish between the people who are kind of deeply involved in Zionist organizing, who know exactly what they're doing, and distinguish them from, kind of people who are outside of that circle and who are just kind of responding more spontaneously to what they think these things mean because of what they've read somewhere or other about it. So when it comes to, we have to, there are so many lies that we have to fight our way through.
Mm-hmm.
We can't be doing that in a way where we kind of water down our own position. If you think that, so the thing that we have to say is, if you believe that Israel has the right to defend itself, then you have to also believe that Palestine has the right to defend itself, right? Like, that seems to me like a crucial point that we need to be making. If you think that, especially because the argument that's being used now is that that these slogans somehow represent an opposition to the two-state solution, right? That if you say from the river to the sea, you don't believe in a two-state solution, you propose a one-state solution. And for a lot of people who use that slogan, that is their position, and that's an honourable position in my opinion. But if your objection to the slogan is that you think that you want to defend a two-state solution, then a two-state solution requires you to recognize Palestine's right of self-defense as much as Israel's right of self-defense. So if you're not talking about Palestine's rights to self-defense, then you're not serious about a two-state solution. And this is what we need to call out the people who are attacking us on, because it's just a blatant hypocrisy, and it's a blatant contradiction in their position.
Absolutely. And I just feel like I'm sometimes living in an episode of Black Mirror or like a dystopian order, because if you look at what happens at Cornell, when there was some threats of anti-Semitism, and there was anti-Semitism threats, and there was violence threats made against Jewish students. And they were also made against Muslim students that the administration ignored. Mm-hmm. But we had the FBI come onto campus immediately and deal with it. We had the university come out with a statement. We have a governor of the state come to campus to reassure Jewish students. We had the non-factor Kamala Harris's husband come onto campus to reassure with Secret Service to reassure Jewish students. So I'm a bit confused. And then we hear this. So there's an actual genocide taking place. And what we're arguing about, what we're having to talk about, is to quell the fears or the irrational fears of some students on campus. And I just feel like I personally am not going to buy into that anymore. And I feel like it's a waste of time.
I think, if we're in a sort of situation where, it's a zero-sum game of attention, right? Like, if that's the situation, then you're absolutely right. The amount of attention that the incident that did happen on Cornell of one student going on a message board and saying stuff that was anti-Semitic, and then the reaction to that is out of all proportion if you compare it with the reaction to what's actually happening outside of that, and how that's affecting Muslim students and other students in Cornell, right? So absolutely. I think we also need to get to the point where we don't necessarily have to think of this as a zero-sum game of attention, right? Like if we're forced to talk about the issue of anti-Semitism, I think we have a better argument about how we oppose anti-Semitism than the Zionists do, actually, right?
Exactly.
Because actually, if you want to talk about anti-Semitism at Cornell, you might want to talk about Ann Coulter before you talk about anyone else being invited to speak at Cornell. You might want to say the best protection against this guy who was going online, who's reading the news about what's happening in Gaza and post something anti-Semitic in response. The best protection for that kind of response to what's happening in Gaza is a very strong pro-Palestinian movement on campus. Because if he wasn't just sitting in his bedroom on his own posting something online, if he was actually on the streets and involved in actual organizations who are pro-Palestinian, that kind of anti-Semitic thinking would have been challenged pretty quickly, and he would have been receiving some political education to get him to understand that it's not actually about the fact that the people doing this are Jews, but it's about Zionism and how Zionism fits into this bigger picture of the US imperialism, right? And so, actually, we are better at dealing with anti-Semitism than they are, right?
Absolutely.
And because we don't play games with this shit. Like
Exactly.
don't play games with anti-Semitism. One
Exactly.
minute Israel is the Jewish state, and any criticism of Israel is a criticism of Jews. So they're equating Israel with Judaism, right?
Exactly.
But but then if people come and say, all right, well then our anger at Israel also means anger at Jews, then that becomes anti-Semitic, right? So they're muddying the water, right?
Yeah.
We're much more principled in how we understand anti-Semitism on our side on this debate,
Exactly.
right? So I don't feel the need to say I don't want to. My take on this is there is a battle for attention, and whose narrative is getting more attention in this. But if we're in the situation where we're talking about anti-Semitism, we're gonna actually have better things to say and more things that capture the real reality of what anti-Semitism looks like. We're going to have more things to say on our side of this argument, the anti-Zionist side of the argument, and
Exactly.
and this is what Jewish anti-Zionists have been saying themselves. So
Absolutely.
I don't even feel like we need to concede that ground to them.
No, I absolutely agree with you. And obviously, we're in this moment where we see a continued confounding of Jewish identity and the state of Israel as a project, as a settler colonial project. And we're seeing this as a deliberate attempt by the Zionists. But I have to ask you, given what the Congress has passed in the House anyway, and one of the provisions is that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. What does this look like going forward? I know it hasn't passed completely yet. It's yet to go to the Senate.
Yeah.
Who knows what's going to happen next? But should we be worried at this point?
Well, I mean, I think we're in a battle, right? We're in a battle. On the one side, we've got this very large mobilization, more and more people learning about the history of the Palestinian struggle, learning about the issues, getting involved. And on the other side, Congress, university administrations, kind of wealthy donors to universities and so on, trying to use their power to stop that from happening, right? And this is one of this kind of legislation is part of that. I mean, I think the most terrifying piece of this that I've seen is the calls that have come from Anti-Defamation League, Brandeis University, and are starting to find their ways entering into some legislatures, like possibly Florida and so on, where they're not just accusing like Students for Justice for Palestine and groups like this of anti-Semitism, but they're saying that they are involved in the material support for Hamas, right? So then you're moving to not just like a kind of censorship issue, but a full-on criminalization issue, because I mean, there's people who've been in federal prisons for 20 years or so right now, like the Holy Land Five, sitting in federal prison right now on exactly those charges of material support for terrorism, right? So they're using, they're trying to mobilize the idea of counterterrorism here as another weapon in their arsenal, and all the legislation that, that was deployed so egregiously in the war on terror. And so that's something that we're going to have to take on if they move in that direction. We've certainly got our hands full in terms of challenging all these attempts to suppress us. We also need to think about at some point in the next few months, this is not necessarily going to be like the kind of front page news story anymore, right? Like at some point they'll and it's obviously a terrifying kind of thought process to try and think through where this is going in Gaza and what the next year is going to look like. But it's possible, at least, that at some point in the coming months, this falls off as kind of headline news. It's a bit more in the background, and of course the violence and the occupation and all the kind of violations of human dignity that involves will be continuing. And our question is going to be, how do we, this momentum that we've built up over the last couple of months, how do we channel that into something that can be sustained going forward out of the immediate crisis? What kind of organizations can we build to hold ourselves together in this and kind of channel that energy going forward, right? And I think that's going to be our challenge, because if we can do that, then we have the resilience to really build something that, that will give us the strength we need to prevent them from using these repressive measures against us. Because that's when it's going to, like right now, they can't, it's not easy for them to censor us, right? Like right now, we're strong enough that when they try to do it in Columbia University and they try to suspend the activities of Students for Justice for Palestine, A few days later, 20 other student organizations in Columbia University said, well, we're with them too. If you want to suspend them, you've got to suspend all of us, right?
Yeah.
Can't do it. They, so basically, that's a sign, that's a sign of our strength right now. We're not going to necessarily be in that position in a few months' time, and that's when they're going to start picking us off, right? So we need to be. I think we need to. It's that moment that we need to be ready for with strong organization, and so I think that's just something to think about going forward.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. In thinking about campus repression specifically, we've noticed that campuses are somewhat a key battleground when it comes to organizing for Palestine. What is the role of campuses in terms of organizing for Palestine, and why does it have this role in your understanding?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure what I think about that, to be honest with you. And I think that part of the answer is just that, there's been this really kind of powerful work that's been done by Students for Justice for Palestine, right, over the last decade or so, that has built up this kind of infrastructure that has been so crucial over the last few months. And partly, I think what's going on as well is that there's, like in 2020, in that summer of 2020, we had 15 million people on the streets after the murder of George Floyd in the Black Lives Matter protests. And my sense of that was, average age would have been like 17, 18 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think my guess is that, I mean, that if you didn't look closely, it seemed like that kind of faded out after a year or two.
Yeah.
But if you're 17 or 18 years old and you kind of join in something like that, it doesn't just disappear from your kind of personality and from who you are. It's there in the background, and it will pop back in new circumstances. That's what I felt at the time. And then I think what's happened this year is that it's precisely those people who were involved in 2020 who are now like, oh, okay, this is something else, right, that we need to be taking a stand on. And if they were 17 in 2020, they're 20 years old now. They're undergraduate students at colleges, and it, they've broadened perhaps their horizon of from thinking about racist violence by police officers and prisons and so on in the United States to thinking about Palestine, which means whether they use the term or not, they're thinking about US imperialism, right? And so I think that's part of the story here, a kind of radicalization, which in a funny way tracks the same process that the movement went through in the 1960s, where people started off thinking about, kind of civil rights in the South and so on, but then within a few years understood that in fact they had to deal with this much bigger system of this kind of US global empire, right? So I think it's something similar, like some at least the trajectory, the direction of travel looks similar to me. The other thing is that like other conservative movements in the United States, Zionism has this view of how to defend itself where universities are central, right? Like, so just like with the kind of conservative attack on critical race theory, right, where they think that, so from their point of view, they think in elitist ways, actually, right? They think that what matters is how is the next generation of the ruling class in the United States being educated, right?
Yeah.
So what matters is what's happening in Harvard and what's happening perhaps in Cornell and UPenn and MIT and Yale and so on, right? And that is, for them, that is the crucial place to intervene politically. And if those students are being taught critical race theory, if those students are being taught about decolonizing, and if they're being taught about Palestine, then they're losing the next generation of the ruling class, right? And so they intervene there, right? Now, and they do that informed by this idea that, they've got these ideas of, the theory of cultural Marxism, right? The idea that, old-fashioned Marxism was defeated, but then this kind of new cultural Marxism came along with the Frankfurt School, and it was basically this conspiracy to win through this kind of control of culture, and universities were central. And so, in other words, the kind of left revolutionary project no longer tried to have a revolution on the streets, but tried to kind of do this cultural revolution in people's minds by controlling universities, right? So, and that's the idea that the conservatives have, and that Zionists have been influenced by as well, even though in many forms that theory is anti-Semitic as well. But my take on this is like the left didn't choose to enter universities, basically the left in the United States would much rather have been powerful on the streets and in workplaces and so on, but wasn't, and so the universities were the only place for it to go, right? And all the sort of people who consider themselves involved in kind of revolutionary movements, 40s, 50s, 60s, all by the 70s, were all teaching at universities just because that's the only place left for them to go. They didn't want to be there; they'd much rather be
Yeah,
on the streets, right? So it's a misreading of the history. But in any case, I think that's why they focus so much attention on what's
on
happening on
universities.
campuses. Yeah, yeah. But I mean, they don't really care that much about the kind of the colleges where working class kids in the United States go to get higher education.
It's
They
true. No,
they
that's
only they're not hauling up there some obscure kind of City University of New York college that is educating kind of multiracial working class students in Queens or something like that. They're going after the big ones because they care about they see it as they look at it in elitist terms, right? They think that it's
yeah.
about the next generation of the ruling class.
No, thank you so much for that. And I want to bring you back to the point. Let's say someone was radicalized during the uprisings during the in the aftermath of the execution of George Floyd. We often hear in that Palestine is the litmus test now, and we have the synergy between Black organizing in the States and Palestinian organizing that goes back decades. Just to maybe unpack that further for our listeners, when we say Palestine the litmus test, how do you understand that?
I mean, I think there is something about this thing that has been true for a long time in US liberal circles, right? Where it's it's progressive except for Palestine, right? The PEP phenomenon, right? Where there was a large number of people who were in their kind of broad political values were progressive or liberal on every issue, but then when you found yourself talking to them about the issue of Palestine, suddenly you find out that they're Zionists, and they don't seem to see a contradiction, right? And so there's various historical reasons why that kind of formation has emerged. You'd want to go back to the kind of, I mean, I think again, like for so many other things, the kind of late 60s, early 70s is this kind of key moment in the emergence of that phenomenon. And so in a moment like this, where the question of Palestine becomes a kind of central political fault line at the moment, it does become a way to see how serious people are about their commitment to human dignity, right, and human freedom. And we don't even have to kind of put it in more radical terms than that kind of language. And just like a lot of this is people on this stuff do not even meet the most basic standard of kind of like a recognition of universal human dignity, right? Where the life of a Palestinian counts for as much as the life of an Israeli. Like, if you can't even meet that basic level of equality and liberalism, then it does discredit any broader claim that you have on around the rest of your politics to being egalitarian and to being a liberal, right? And so you want so I think that's why this idea of the kind of litmus test has emerged, and you do find that it is clarifying, right? It's a clarifying moment, because all kinds of people that you wouldn't necessarily have thought of as Zionists suddenly emerge as on the wrong side of this debate, right? And then also on the in the other direction as well, people who you wouldn't necessarily expect come out as making very kind of decent statements on this stuff in ways that can sometimes be surprising, right? So it's clarifying precisely because there is so often a disjunction in terms of what people think about in terms of Israel Palestine and the rest of their politics, right?
Absolutely. And I guess finally, then, what does the Palestinian, in your reading, the Palestinian struggle represent?
Well, I mean, I think that the answer to that is always going to be a little subjective, but I think that I would say that so I agree with those people who've argued that Zionism is a settler colonial project, and what's distinctive about it compared to other settler colonial projects is the particular late stage in the game at which that project begins. Like in the 1940s, when the Nakba happens, is when the other parts of Asia and Africa and the Caribbean and Latin America are freeing themselves from direct European colonialism. And it's exactly at that moment that the Palestinians suffer their greatest catastrophe as victims of colonialism. And that's what gives Zionism its particular characteristic. And it's why when in the late 60s, having been failed by the kind of systems of international diplomacy and advocacy that they'd relied on up until then, and having been failed by the neighboring Arab nation states to achieve their freedom, the Palestinians take up an armed struggle at that point. It becomes the most widely supported and best funded of all the kind of national liberation insurgencies around the world at that time, of which there were many. And it becomes that because I think for most of the people of the world who are looking at this, they see in what's happened to the Palestinians something that is a kind of reminder of their own colonial past, of the worst kind of excesses and the most terrible moments in their own colonial past. And therefore, the fear is that if the Palestinians can't prevail, then what has happened to the Palestinians is also that the future for the rest of us. And so it has that resonance, that symbolism, that what is done to the Palestinians today will be done to the rest of us tomorrow. Now, and on the Israeli side, they also mobilize the same kind of equation, right? Where they say, look at how successfully we're able to contain this insurgency and maintain this occupation. And don't you want the same kinds of techniques and technologies and surveillance systems and walls that we have and that have proven so successful here? Don't you want that for your insurgent populations as well? And they become, and I think now this is central to Israel's place in the world, it is the leading edge provider of technologies of repression, right? For any authoritarian regime around the world that wants to do something similar, right? So in that way, again, our freedom in the end depends on the freedom of the Palestinians, and so I think that's why you get this. The Palestinian issue always means so much more than just about what is being done to the Palestinians. I remember a few years ago, I gave a talk at a university in Canada, and I wasn't really talking about Zionism, but I said something in passing about it. One of the people in the audience disagreed with what I had to say and rolled out the standard kind of Zionist arguments against it. And we went back and forth a little, but then something very interesting happened. Someone else in the audience who was Colombian stood up, and he was incensed, and he launched a really powerful tirade against the Zionists, because he said, I don't think that I can support what you're saying because I know what the Israelis did in Colombia. I don't even have to think about Palestine. I know what the Israelis did in Colombia. They trained our paramilitaries. They were responsible for the violence that was done to my people, right? And so the solidarity that he felt with the Palestinian cause is not about looking from a distance and saying, isn't it awful what they're doing to those people? It comes from precisely the role that Zionism has as a supplier of repression for all kinds of contexts around the world, right? It's purely self-interested and based on his own experience of his community that he's an anti-Zionist, right? And I think that's crucial.
No, thanks for raising that, because it reminds me of the talk you gave at Cornell recently when in the Q&A people spoke about solidarity. And you said that solidarity, and this is, I guess I'm putting this into my words, how I understood what you were saying, is that solidarity isn't sympathy. So you're not like having this, oh, I feel bad for these people. You're saying that I recognize that it is in my own interest to have these systems fall as well.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. And in our case in the United States, we need to free ourselves from Zionism as much for our interests in the United States, because they're training our cops to be more violent. They're allowing universities to be more and more repressive places. Zionism is central to the war on terror, which is responsible for so much violence in our country. So there's all these ways that we fight because we know what's happening in Palestine, but we also fight because Zionism means something here as well, right? In how it corrupts this country.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This was a great talk, actually, a great discussion. I highly recommend checking out the writings of our guest, Arun Kundnani. You find them online. An amazing writer, and I think his work is well worth engaging with. Thank you so much for joining us. Take care.
Thank you.